So welcome to the last lecture on ancient Rome, and we're talking about Roman mural painting. As I had mentioned in the last lecture, we don't have much in the way of surviving paintings in Greek styles. However, the Roman styles are very similar. So by looking at ancient Roman painting that survived, and I'll explain why that is going to survive in a moment, we can see both styles. So during the Roman Empire, Pompeii was a port known for agriculture and commerce. And you can see a picture right here. It was near the foot of Mount Vesuvius. So Mount Vesuvius is right here. You can see Pompeii. A volcano that no one had remembered erupting. So in 79 AD, the people of Pompeii were buried under volcanic ash when Vesuvius erupted. A nearby resort town, Herculaneum, was buried in mud and lava. So Pompeii was basically forgotten until 1592 when the city was rediscovered during the building of a canal. So when you build a canal, you're digging deep holes in the ground. And when they dug into the volcanic ash, they found cavities. So excavations of these cities began in the 18th century. And the volcanic ash preserved almost everything, even the people of Pompeii. So this is somewhat morbid, but cavities in the ash were found during excavations and filled with plaster. When the plaster casts were brought up, the shape of people and household items were preserved. So the people have long eroded away down to their bones, but the shape of them when they died was preserved. So a lot of people find this rather morbid, but just a warning, the next thing you might find more morbid. So even people's dogs. So at this time in Pompeii, and we have I'm not going to show you, but there's a bunch of artwork showing that dogs were really important to the people of Pompeii. And the types of dogs that they had are most similar to the modern American pit bull. So possibly pit bulls and bulldogs in general were descended from these dogs at the ancient Roman time. So I give you all this not because you have to know it for the test, because you don't. However, I did have a student in a previous class when we used to do creative projects who wanted to learn how fresco was done. And I'm going to give you a video that will show you the details of fresco and the descriptions for this video. However, just to give you a little bit of an idea of how it works. So the true fresco technique consists of painting on a wet plaster surface using pigments mixed with lime water. Paint forms a chemical bond with the plaster as it dries, resulting in a highly durable painted surface. So since the lime plaster dries in approximately a day, artists had to apply fresh plaster every morning to the area of the fresco with the finished complete that day. Hence, a finished fresco comprises a series of colored plaster patches. Each individual patch is visible when the finished painting is typically called a giornata, or 1 day's work. So again, you don't have to know this part for the test, but if you're interested in making one, this will be useful for you. So calcium hydrate, burned limestone, or marble mixed with water combined with carbon dioxide, resulting in the formation of calcium carbonate, limestone, marble. It's like painting with molten marble. So this is the type of technique, as I mentioned in the Minoan, in the lecture on the Minoan period, that you want to use if you want your paintings to last. So the styles of wall painting. And these styles of wall painting are not coming from the ancient Romans themselves, but coming from art historians who are looking at the art after it's been excavated. So at Pompeii, there were 4 styles of painting that existed, each succeeding the last with some overlap. And I'll show you some examples of the styles in a moment. The first style, from about 200 to 80 BCE, painting illusionistically recreates slabs of colored marble set off by actual architectural details. And again, I'll give you illustrations so you understand what this is. The second style, from 80 until about 15 BCE, a shallow space was created occupied by figures which extend the space of the room. This is the style that you're probably most likely familiar with if you think of paintings in Pompeii. We'll see more examples. So the third style, from about 15 BCE until 45 AD, wall surface was painted a solid color with slender decorative architectural elements. and small vignettes within them. So this is one of the stranger styles we'll see. And then the fourth style, a synthesis of all the previous styles. That's kind of cheating with the fourth style, but let's see some examples. So this is an example of second style, the painting that we're seeing in the middle here. However, we can see hints of the first style in these details right here, which seem to illusionistically create the effect of molding. So this may look really realistic when you see it in person, but it's not molding, it's two-dimensional. One of the reasons why people did this is because living in Pompeii was pretty expensive, even for wealthy people. So they could get these paintings and be able to create some more space in their rooms. Not necessarily the case with this one, but we'll see what later on. So a narrative story is told about a marriage ritual involving Dionysus, who's known as Bacchus, and his wife Ariadne. So they call these the Dionysic mystery theories, and that refers to the idea that these Dionysian religions, or Bacchal religions, if you want to call them that, were called mystery religions or mystery cults. And remember, cult just means a small group of people practicing a religion. It doesn't have any negative connotations when we're talking about it in this context. This is the way the entire wall looks like. And we'll look at some individual panels. So the background is known as Pompeian red, because you find this throughout Pompeii, especially in the second style paintings. Above the pilasters are panels painted to look like marble ground. So all of this gives you the impression of 3 dimensions, even though this is a 2-dimensional flat wall. So as you can see, there's a lot of emotion in these paintings. We get in close, you can see the woman that is placing her head in the lap of the other woman. You can see by her gestures, by covering her face, and by the way she's being held by the other figure, and also her downturned eyes, that she's probably sad or going through an emotional event. So the dancing setter, the exact meaning of these scenes are unknown, but it depicts some sort of sacred ritual. And Dionysic cults, what they celebrated was basically the spice of life. So sometimes, like in a patriarchal culture, they would say wine, women, and song. So in other words, sex, love, lust, drinking, partying, socializing, all those sorts of things. What's interesting about these is they are kind of creating a mystical effect. When you look at the figures, they have 3 dimensions. They seem to have like molding with light, which I'll talk about in a moment. But they don't cast shadows, and they exist in a space that doesn't seem realistic. So ritual eroticism is a subtext of the main narrative. And again, this comes from the idea of Dionysic cults. So this is Odysseus being attacked by the Laestrygonians. And this is a second style getting into a third style. So it tells a story from the Odyssey that you may be familiar with. I hear they still do the Odyssey in high school. So the Laestrygonians are giants, and Odysseus and his men landed on an island inhabited by these man-eating giants. So that's what we're seeing in this picture, and that's why we see them so huge against trees. So this has a naturalistic depiction, typical of a second style painting, but again, it's kind of be similar to what we see in the later styles as well. What is naturalistic? It means that the artists are trying to create a scene that resembles real life. Obviously, there aren't man-eating giants in real life, but they're trying to put these people into the scene to make it realistic. So one thing you could do, and you could do it on a credit board, I'm going to do it for you in a moment, but I highly suggest you pause and try to do it yourself. Just try to find the things that the artist did to make things look realistic. So I suggest you pause the video now. Try to find elements of the painting that make it 3-dimensional or realistic. Okay, so you ready? You got a list of things? So one of the things you'll notice is that they cast shadows. and they cast shadows all in the same direction. So what that tells you is that there's a source of light over here to the left. And by doing that, not only does it cast shadows, but it also enables the artist to mold the figures and make them look three-dimensional with light. So you have, as you can see, the light hits these figures and we have a highlight, and then they go into shadow. And by modulating those shadows, the artist can create a three-dimensional effect, like this is a person or a giant, lesser Godian, who is three-dimensional. You can almost reach into this two-dimensional frame and pick them out. So a few other, and you can see that throughout the painting with the stones and with the trees as well. So another thing you may notice is what's called atmospheric perspective. And that is when you look into the background, you see how the figures are kind of faded, looking blue or gray. Since we live in Michigan, this may be hard to see, but if you live in a place that's mountainous, you get on top of a mountain, you look at the mountains in the background, you notice as they get farther away, they're more gray or blue. And that's because we're looking at it through the sky. So atmospheric perspective is just a way to simulate looking at far off things through the sky, so through the atmosphere. And artists are doing this at this time. A few other things, and they may seem super obvious, but you don't necessarily see them in other paintings, like in ancient Egypt. We have overlap, so we have a stone here that overlaps the figure in the background, and then this figure in the foreground overlaps the stone. So by doing that and placing figures and items and throughout the background, midground, or foreground, it enables you to get sense of space. And if we get kind of close in here, you can see a couple of little details that will tell us that they're really trying to create something naturalistic. So not only is the shadow of this goat, I think that's a goat, is being cast to the right, showing a light source over here, but we also see that the goat sees this reflection in the water. So another little detail to add some naturalism, simulation of real life in this painting. Oh, this one's so beautiful, they just recently cleaned it. This is Young Woman with a Stylus. Stylus is this pen. And this is not a normal pen like you have or a pencil. The tablets he's using are made of wax. Since paper was really expensive, when people were trying to brainstorm or work out their thoughts, they would do it on these wax tablets. And then once they had done that enough, and they're scratching in with a sharp edge, once they had done that enough, then they could eventually transfer it to paper or vellum, whatever they were using. But these are very expensive at the time, so you do a lot of notes before you make it permanent. So she's sometimes called Sappho, and that's a reference to a feminine ancient Greek philosopher. And I mentioned about how the Greeks are misogynistic and didn't think that women could be philosophers, and she actually addresses that. In some ways, unfortunately, she buys into that. But it is interesting to see how she was able to survive in that particular environment as an intellectual. But even if I didn't tell you these things, I think there's some qualities about her that would lead you to believe that she is a scholar. And so this would be another opportunity where you kind of like pause and look at this picture and tell me, based on the details you see, what you know about this person. So take a pause. You're ready to start again. I'll tell you what most of my classes do. One of the things they notice is that she must be wealthy. And I ask them why. She says, well, she has gold earrings. She has this fancy hairpiece that also seems to have gold in it. She has a painting that is done of her. That tells you that she has, or at least her family has some wealth. You see her hair is very nicely done. You don't wake up in the morning like this. So you can tell that she's wealthy. The other thing is that people can often figure out she's a scholar, first off, because it looks like she has a pen, a stylus, but it's the same idea. But she's also being thoughtful. And this is one of those kind of like symbols that is almost universal. You're thinking and you like bring the pen to your mouth and kind of tap it and look upwards, and people can read that gesture as someone being thoughtful. So Tondo, there used to be relief sculptures with rounded frames of ancestors. So for the Romans, ancestors and family are very important. But this is a painted Tondo, so it's a little bit cheaper to do it this way. And we would call this a third style. But what's most characteristic of the third style is something like this, which is very strange. We see these slender architectural elements, which are illusionistic. They're using a little bit of perspective, meaning they're thinking of all the lines in the picture leading towards the disappearing point. And I'll give you a video that will have an example of how perspective works in more detail. Although I should mention right now, with that video, it will explain the mathematical perspective. We don't have evidence that the Romans knew about mathematical perspective, but they got the concept and they tried to use it. So what we see here is something that's rather strange. You have that background that's dark blue. And what that would do is, again, even for wealthy people, living in Pompeii is pretty expensive. Those would expand the space of the room with a dark color. But then you're probably like, why is there this head being tied up and floating? That's not a head. It's a tragic mask from the theater. So like painting and sculpture, the Romans also were fond of Greek-style theater. And in some Greek styles of theater, instead of having actors who use their own faces to express emotions, since you want to transmit to the back of this big crowd, they would use masks. So this one, where it seems like someone's screaming into the void, that would be the tragic mask. And they would have other ones that are like smiling or laughing, and then other ones that are sad. And that way you can kind of transmit the emotions of the character to the audience. So you get in close, again, staring into the void. So the miniature figures inside the painted architecture. And this makes for, a rather strange effect sometimes. This one, same sort of style. We see a gazebo. A gazebo is this type of like covered area. And we see a couple of peacocks. So kind of like people do when they get married today sometimes. People get married outside and they'll have a gazebo to cover the people who are getting married. And they'll do that part of the ceremony within the gazebo. So this is similar in ancient Rome. This is probably to celebrate a marriage. The reason why is because the peacocks are a symbol of Juno, who is the wife of Zeus / Jupiter. That's what she's known. Hera in ancient Greece, she's known as. In ancient Rome, she's known as Juno, and she is the patron goddess of marriage. So that's probably what this is all about. But same sort of effect, these slender architectural elements and dark background closely in. So another thing you see with the third style is these landscapes. This landscape of a boat, just an everyday scene, nothing particularly important. On the buildings, you can see how the lines are all at an angle. And again, it's not quite mathematical like people in the Renaissance would do, but it's the same idea. You have all these lines leading off into the background. It gives you a kind of progression of 3 dimensions. You can also see some atmospheric perspective, casting shadows, reflections on water, all of these things to make things look a little bit more naturalistic. So in this, we see less of an emphasis on human figures, like in the second style. Usually the human figures are really small compared to the landscape. This is a 4th style painting. We could probably put it in another style, but the date puts it in the 4th style. And it's a still life of peaches. So the shaded peaches convincingly occupy space, and the glass is naturalistically rendered, and the highlights are visible in the peaches in the glass. So what you can do is you can identify the highlights in each picture, and from that you can find the direction of the light along with the shadows. So the light is coming from here, And they're using this light source, and this is something you learn in a drawing class, to render these peaches to make them look three-dimensional. So they have various levels of shadows, shading on the peach itself, and then shadows that are thrown down about it. And this gives the viewer the impression that this is three-dimensional, the real object in the picture. So what you're kind of seeing here is like, nowadays you can go to the store and get peaches for pretty cheap. But what this is showing is what the Romans want to show if they're pretty well off. Is they want to show that they're good hosts, that they're able to provide for their guests. So the fruit that is portrayed here shows that they can do that. It's not just the fruit itself, but a symbol of fruit. If you come into my house, I can provide for you, I can feed you. And then the glass, which again, you can buy one of these at Walmart for a couple of bucks. But back then, to have transparent glass, it's very thin like this, would be an item that only the elite wealthy could buy. So by portraying this glass here, it is showing, again, their wealth and ability to provide for their guests. So I should say as a side note, I'm always impressed when people are able to create a three-dimensional effect with a transparent item. My brother is an artist. He was quite good at doing this with glasses and other transparent items. And I asked him, how do you do this? And his answer wasn't very helpful. He just said, well, look at what you see and then just put it on the paper. Not particularly helpful, but if you take drawing class, you'll be able to learn the techniques to be able to do what the artist had done here. So this is Hercules strangling the serpents. If your only exposure to the Hercules story is the Disney animated movie, which is quite good, I love it, you may get a different story. In that one, they make it seem like Hera and Zeus were a happily married couple, and that they were the parents of Hercules. Somehow it worked out in real life because remember when the ancient Greeks thought of their gods, they thought of them as humans with human foibles. So in some ways, like worse than what they thought humans on the ground were like. So the real story is that Hercules was the son of Jupiter, and then Zeus in ancient Greece, and the mortal Athene, who is pictured right here. Juno, who is Hera in ancient Greece, she became jealous and sent snakes down to kill the baby Hercules. So unlike the Disney story where they have Hades doing it, instead we have Juno doing it. But as you can see, little baby Hercules is quite fit for an infant, is able to take care of these snakes quite easily. And if you look at the man who thought he was Hercules' father, Amphitryon, who is pictured right here, he's beginning to look a little skeptical. He's scratching his beard and thinking, why is this human baby of mine able to take care of these like mystical snakes sent from the heaven? So what I think is kind of interesting is you'll see this type of stance that seems to be questioning or doubtful whenever we look at Christian art later on, the portrayals of Joseph, who is the human not father, but thought he was the father, or typically but the human not father of Jesus Christ. So Alcmene seems to be leaving the scene, but turns back to Hercules. So she's obviously a little freaked out, but wants to also protect her son. And the eagle, who's right here, is a reference to Jupiter and the Roman army. So you'll kind of find that in a lot of Roman pieces, where there'll be kind of like a little bit of propaganda for the Roman Empire embedded into a lot of pictures, associating themselves with the power of the gods, or the power of Jupiter in this case. There's a lot of stuff in here, and you can kind of pause if you want to and pick out the things that make this look three-dimensional. So go ahead and do that. Now explain all the things we talked about: shadows, molding with light with the figures, a little bit of perspective going on, but also something that we hadn't really seen before, for what is called foreshortening. And you can really see it in the feet here. And that's probably part of the reason why this figure is placed here, with the feet going off in the background, because the artist wanted to show off how they could use foreshortening. So what foreshortening means is if you were to show a foot from the side, it would be longer. So if you want to show something disappearing in the background or coming towards you, you have to shorten it a little bit. And as things get farther and farther in the background, you would shorten them more and more. So it's quite a challenging thing to do with body parts because they're irregularly shaped. So the artist is kind of showing what they can do with create a three-dimensional illusion here. So as far as Hercules and the way it's posed, what do you think about I don't know, particular? That's because it is. It refers to a Hellenistic Greek sculpture that was originally done in bronze. But what we're seeing here is a marble copy of it, most likely by the Romans. And it pictures Laocoon, who's right here, and his sons. And Laocoon is a priest of the Trojans, so from the story of ancient Troy, if you're familiar with it, and the Trojan horse. So in that story, the Trojans and the Greeks are in this war, and obviously everyone wants to end the war, but the Greeks want to win. So what they do is they create this giant horse that's made out of wood and is on wheels, and they say, this is our gift for peace. And the Trojans are like, cool, yeah, we like a wooden horse, and they roll the thing in. But unbeknownst to the Trojans, the Greeks had a garrison of soldiers hiding out inside of the horse. And after the Trojans went to sleep, this garrison was able to jump out of the horse and attack the Trojans from the inside. So you might think, wow, this is a really bad ruse. Maybe somebody should have thought of this. And someone did. Laocoon was like, hey, maybe the people that are in the war with, we shouldn't do this, but this giant thing that seems suspiciously heavy. And he was hoping to tell people. He told his sons about his misgivings about this particular gift. But we bring Poseidon in the story again. Poseidon was quite a big fan of the Greeks. And he decided he was going to send down a sea monster to strangle Laocoon and his sons to prevent him from killing the Trojans. So this particular pose, which we're not going to get to Renaissance in this class, but became very popular later on in the Renaissance when this particular figure was dug up. When they were building another canal, things in the building a canal. So the artist who made the Hercules picture knew about this in ancient times and took this really dynamic pose for Hercules. So again, you can pick out things or probably things I mentioned before about how you create illusions to space. So a list of all the things that are used, just like we had looked at before. So the last one is I wanted to show you the context. When I was sitting in classes like this one, we'd see the paintings on panels, but then we wouldn't see how they actually worked in the room. So what you see here is how they would work in particular rooms. We have this first style, kind of like illusionistic slabs of marble and molding. But there's also these spaces created where artists try to get really clever, where you can imagine you could walk into the wall and go into these spaces in the background. So very kind of tricky style where the artists are showing off a little and creates an interesting effect. When we get to the proto-Renaissance towards the end of the class, we'll see these sorts of styles return.